I'm Bob LeMin with LCTV. We're here at Forney Polo Field in lovely Rossville, PA, with noted author Duncan Alderson. Duncan has just published a novel which has received national acclaim. It's been rated the #1 must-read by Harper's Bazaar. Duncan, welcome to LCTV and Taking a Look.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
And we've known each other through polo on the sidelines here for many years, and I want to congratulate you on your recent successful debut novel, Magnolia City.
Thank you very much.
How did you come up with the inspiration to write a book like this?
Well, I grew up seeing these pictures of my mother dressed as a flapper in the 1920s, in Texas in the 1920s. And then when she died, I found this box of memorabilia, family stuff, and here were these pictures again. So it just, the woman in the pictures looked so exotic. She was wearing the furs and the pearls and the cloche hat and all the fashions. So I decided I had to write a book to explain who this woman was, because she was so different from the mother who raised me.
So this was a side of your mother that you really didn't know until after she passed.
I didn't know at all.
Wow.
And it really sparked my imagination to imagine the life of this kind of a woman in Texas in the Roaring '20s, because we don't hear much about Texas during that period, but it was a very interesting period in the state's history. So as I dug into it, I discovered all kinds of interesting things that I used in the novel.
Very good. And one thing I realized that I didn't know was the nickname, I guess, for Houston was Magnolia City back in the day.
You know, I grew up in Houston, and I did not know that it was called the Magnolia City. And that was one of the exciting discoveries I made as I dug into the research. And it was named after Magnolia Park, which was meant to rival Central Park. It was along the ship channel in Houston, and there were 3,750 magnolia trees planted in this park.
Back in the 20s?
And they would all bloom at once, and they said the fragrance was just amazing.
Wow.
It's gone now, but it was there in the 1920s.
Wow. So that's probably a relatively rare fact that the average Texan wouldn't know.
No.
And you are you're a son of the Lone Star State.
Yes, I was born in Houston, Texas.
And you've been in Lancaster for about 20 years?
Yes, I have.
Very good.
And I wrote the book here. I spent 10 years writing the book here in Lancaster. But I was writing about Texas. It's funny, when I lived there, I couldn't wait to get out of Texas, but now I'm writing about it. So I have this love-hate relationship with my native state.
The work drew you back. So
it did.
It really was a labor of love. I understand it took about 10 years from concept to press.
You know, my editor says, you've written a love letter to the state of Texas. And one of the women who reviewed it for the Texas Writers Society said it made her proud to be a Texas woman.
That's saying something. That's great. I know the book talks about the Roaring '20s with flappers, with women who smoke, who feel liberated after World War I, lucky strikes.
It's fun to imagine your mother that way.
Or my grandmother. So tell us more about how you developed your lead character for this book. Was it a composite?
Well, it's funny. It started with the pictures of my mother, and her name was Dottie. But Dottie kind of shape-shifted into Hetty, who's the name of the character in the book. And she took on a life of her own, which I think happens in good fiction, that the characters come to life. And I really think there's more of me than my mother in this character, even though she's a woman. The gender doesn't matter. It's the personality traits. And Flaubert famously said, Madame Bovary, c'est moi. She's me, and I think Hetty is me too.
And Hetty has some interesting friends.
Yes, she does.
At the dances and I guess the college years, growing up years, the formative years.
Yeah, I had to create, of course, all her friends and her family, and that's why it takes 10 years, because there's so much. You have to dream a whole world into being when you write a novel.
And I noticed on your acknowledgement page, there's a lot of names.
A lot of names.
All over the map.
I had a lot of help with this.
And you've been a writer, a teacher, a published author, kind of a man of arts and letters. Have you been inspired by your students?
Yes, in fact, I know the polo team here is called Rabbit Hill, And my studio that I ran, a creative writing studio, was called the Rabbit Hill Writers Studio.
I remember that.
Named after Rossville, because Rabbit Hill was the original name for Rossville, because the German settlers used to raise hares up here on the hill. So that's where the name comes from. And my students helped a lot. Even though I was the director, they let me workshop my novel as part of the critiques that we had. And they really helped me a lot to shape the novel and to sort of autocorrect as I went along.
Were you surprised it took 10 years?
No. The hard part was the last couple of years where I really had to push through to the climax, because that takes a lot out of you emotionally, psychologically, physically, just to get those last few chapters done where everything comes together in this grand finale. So that was the hardest part.
Will there be a sequel?
Yes. In fact, the sequel was already written. The sequel is called The Tibetan Magic Show, and it was written before this was written. This actually sprang out of that. But I now have to rewrite the sequel to mesh the two books together, because the characters have all changed and everything's changed, so it's going to take a lot of rewriting.
That is a very cool title, The Tibetan Magic Show. I look forward to seeing
It's
that.
about Hetty's children in the 1960s.
Okay, and I can see where we're going with that.
The idea was that the 20s and the 60s were the decades of the greatest social change in the States during the 20th century. So I wanted to focus on those two periods to show these revolutions that happened, really. The one that happened to the mother and then the one that happens to the son in the 60s. So.
Have the people that have reviewed your book, is there anything the critics have missed? Because it's gotten some nice reviews and some good buzz. But for someone that might be looking at this and you know, being exposed to your work for the first time, what would you like to tell them?
I don't think people have realized that this is revisionist Texas history, that there's a whole new movement now to revise Texas history. You know, Texas has been so memorialized in the cowboy myth. We always think of Texas and West Texas and the tumbleweeds and the cowboys, but that's only one part of Texas. There are 5 geological zones. So I wanted to revise Texas history and tell some of the stories of real people in the 1920s in Houston, completely different from cowboy. There were no cowboys in Houston. That didn't come about until the 1930s when they started the Houston Fat Stock Show and Rodeo. Before that, Houston was really, it was a small southern town. And there was this elite that lived there, of the cotton barons and the new oil rich, and they lived behind the gates of Cortland Place, and they lived this kind of elegant Edwardian lifestyle, which most people don't associate with Houston, but it's there. If you dig back into the history, you'll find it. It was the Magnolia City.
The Magnolia City does give it more of a southern flavor. It almost makes me think of New Orleans. But I think as people delve into your book, they'll not only get a good read, but they'll get a history lesson, and they'll get a new appreciation.
And I think this is important because the main heroine, she has to struggle against this southern code of behavior that was kind of rigid, and women were expected to be a certain thing. Even though they were liberated in the 20s, there was a strong etiquette that was ruling everybody's lives back then, especially if you were in the upper crust. And she's born in privilege, and then she falls and has to struggle her way back. So she definitely fights against the southern code of behavior.
Right, because it was almost scandalous back then for women to smoke in public.
Before World War I, only prostitutes smoked. So for women to smoke in public in the 1920s was revolutionary. And her father, Kirby Allen, who's descended from the founders of the city, he's not happy that she smokes at all. And she flaunts it in front of him, of course.
We've come a long way, baby.
Really?
So just some last thoughts before we take a break. It was a labor of love, 10 years. Did it feel like 10 years, or did it feel like 20 years?
You know, at one point I thought I would never finish it, and I thought it would never get published. Then it took me another 5 years to find an agent and a publisher.
So
because I finished it in 2005.
Oh my goodness! So the marketing, the shopping,
that was the hard part. Writing it was
right,
easy.
Right. The book tour. I believe this book has taken you across the pond. I believe. Weren't you in Paris?
I was in Paris, and I guess my greatest achievement, besides being chosen as #1 by Harper's Bazaar, was that Shakespeare and Company, which is this legendary bookstore in Paris that has been there since the 1920s, the Lost Generation, they are carrying Magnolia City.
That's pretty neat for a lad from Lancaster.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very proud of that.
And great, Duncan. We're going to take a short break, and we'll be right back on LCTV.
LCTV 66 is your community channel, and your donations keep us on the air and help to produce more local programs. Send your tax-deductible donation of $500, $100, or more to the address on the screen. Or think of it this way: for the price of a couple of movie tickets, you can help support your community channel. Send what you can and be a part of all that is good about Lancaster County. Thank you for your tax-deductible donation to LCTV 66, Lancaster's Connection.
Hello, I'm Bob LeMin with LCTV. We're here at Forney Polo Field relaxing after a polo match with noted author Duncan Alderson. We're taking a look at his new novel, Magnolia City. Duncan, this book was written from a woman's point of view. That's an interesting take. What inspired you to do it that way?
You know, I didn't choose to write from a woman's point of view. It kind of chose me. I was writing the Tibetan Magic Show, which is written from a male point of view. And in that novel, the mother goes into this long reverie about her youth in the 1920s. And one of my writing coaches at the time said, you know, I really like this chapter about the mother. Why don't you let the mother tell her story? So I decided to do that, and it just exploded into this other book. And I realized I had this strong female voice in me that I didn't know was there. I guess Jung would call it my anima. Jung said every man had a woman inside of him, so I guess this is my anima speaking. Hetty.
Wow. Well, speaking of women in your life, tell us a little bit about a very important person, your wife, Isabel.
Well, the novel's dedicated to my wife, Isabel Lark, and the interesting story about that is that before we met, she read one of my manuscripts. She read the Tibetan Magic Show, and she liked it. And she said, I've got to meet this guy. She fell in love with my writing first, so then she met me, and she liked me too.
Don't judge a book by its cover. That's great. Just a personal note here, I'm old enough to remember when Isabel, or Izzy as her friends call her, was going to school at F&M. So Izzy and I go way back in the day. So that's cool. It's kind of neat to see how things circle and come around, and it's a big old goofy world. It's still a small world, but that's fun.
Well, I'm not from Lancaster, of course.
Right,
I'm a native Texan.
Right,
and
but you don't have that southern drawl.
Well,
guess.
you know, I lived in England for a year, then I lived in Canada for 20 years, so I think I lost my Texas drawl. But I am bilingual. I mean, I can pull it out when I have to.
Up in the Great White North.
I like to write about those all men. We call oil is called all, the all men.
The all. Yes. And I think I was intrigued by some of the names in the book. I think there's a Lamar, for example.
Yes.
So of course I got a vision of an oil baron from the Hunt family.
I tried to take names out of Texas history. Of course, Lamar, I think, was one of the heroes of the Alamo. And
there's a Garrett.
There's a Garrett. Then Rusk. Lamar's last name is Rusk. There's a Rusk County in Texas. So I tried to choose names because I think these place names really help to localize the story.
Right.
And for instance, Lamar Rusk, he and his father have the Splendora oil company. There is a Splendora, Texas. But there was no oil field there. But I like that name Splendora because it had a splendor about it.
That's interesting. Speaking of some of the characters in the book, Duncan, Hetty, I guess, has a sister, Charlotte. But there's some sibling rivalry there. They seem to have some issues.
You know, it's interesting. I had different editors working on the book, and the first editor wanted to know the story of the backstory of the father, Hetty's father, so I had to fill that in. Kirby Allen, who's descended from the founders of the city, and he's a banker, so I had to fill that story in first. Then my editor at Kensington, who published the book, he wanted the backstory of the two sisters filled in. He wondered why they didn't get along. So I had to think about that. Well, why don't they get along? And then I realized that that was the key to the whole novel. So I wrote this backstory of the two sisters and their sibling rivalry, and it really unlocked everything for me. So that's where a good editor is quite invaluable.
It's really a team effort. It's not a writer locked away in a room somewhere.
No.
Do you try to write every day?
When I'm working on something, I do. I try to put 4 or 5 hours a day in weekdays. I don't write on weekends because I need to have a life.
Got to come up to Polo, right?
Yes.
And you've been writing for quite some time.
I wrote my first novel in high school.
Born to write.
It was called Retama, which is a type of tree that grows in South Texas. But the novel was set in East Texas, so it didn't make sense. But I was a teenager at the time, so.
Retama, that's another colorful title. So we got the Tibetan Magic Show, and we have Magnolia City, and we have Retama. And I look forward to more work from you, Duncan. Can you tell us maybe what you're working on next, or what you're working on today?
Well, the sequel. I have to get the sequel done. My editor originally said he wanted it on his desk by December, but I don't think I can do that. I think it's going to take me longer than that. So he said, it's okay, take all the time you need, but not 10 years.
Not 10 years. And do you think the sequel will be titled The Tibetan Magic Show?
Well, that's what I'm hoping, because it really suits it. But it suits the 1960s, I think.
Okay.
And there is a Lama, a Tibetan Lama, that's one of the characters in the story. So, and he teaches by putting on magic shows. So it's very interesting.
We need a Lama here at Polo for the halftime breaks, for the entertainment. Where can people buy your book, Duncan?
Well, it's on Amazon, of course. And Aaron Books from Lidditz was here last week selling the book. So they still have copies. I don't know about Barnes & Noble, but all the booksellers are carrying
and online, and I understand there's an audio version.
It just came out, an audio version of Magnolia City, read by an award-winning narrator, Dan John Miller. Wow. He's also a movie star. He was in Walk the Line. So it's wonderful to hear the book brought to life and all the characters brought to life. For me, it's like hearing a whole new book.
That would be interesting, especially from the author's point of view, to hear it in another person's voice.
It is. Yes.
I'll have to check that out. That sounds like fun. Let's see, what else do we want to cover here? Magnolia City, Aaron's books, online version. Do you still teach locally? I know you established the Rabbit Hill Writers Group.
No, I haven't taught since 2005. I closed the studio to focus on getting the book published.
Sure.
One final word might be that I hope people will enjoy the book, and that people will realize that it's part of this new movement of revisionist history. So much history is being rewritten now. We're delving back and finding that a lot of the stereotypes are no longer true, and that we want to get back to the reality of what happened. So this I consider part of that. I was trying deliberately to help to revise Texas history and tell some of the many other stories there are to tell from that part of the United States.
Very good. And as a native son of the Lone Star State, when you went back to research the book, I know you spent some considerable time on the road and in libraries and oil fields and just, uncovering all kinds of clues and putting a giant jigsaw puzzle together. How, now that you're more of a Pennsylvanian, what was your reaction to how Texas has changed over the last, say, 20 years?
Well, it's interesting. In the novel, the mother of Hetty, Nella, she's on part of this committee that's trying to turn Houston into the Paris of the South. They had all these ideas. The Forum of Civics, it was called. And I talk about that in the book. And it was voted down because of zoning. Houston famously has no zoning.
Right.
So it's just sprawling all over the place. And she says, I shudder to think what this city will be like in 50 years with no zoning.
And she was right. It is.
And she was right.
An architectural and a traffic nightmare and a billboard paradise. If you like billboards.
When I went back just recently on my book tour, I realized how much the city has changed since I grew up there, back in happy days.
Right. And we have about a minute left, Duncan. So as we wrap it up here at lovely Forney Field, following a great polo match today. Just some closing thoughts.
Well, just that this book, I think I put everything into this book. It's really my magnum opus because I've been working on it for so much of my life. I mean, the first kernel that I wrote, that this came out of, I wrote 40 years ago, back in the 1970s. And I didn't actually write the book until the last 10 years, but I have put so much of myself and so much of my life into writing this book. I hope people will read it and enjoy it.
Very good.
And learn more about Texas, the Texas you didn't know about.
The Texas.
There's more than cowboys there.
More than cowboys and tumbleweeds. Well, Duncan, it's been a pleasure, and I want to invite people to check out Duncan's book. If you live locally, please go to Aaron's book, buy it online, check out the audio version. Always a pleasure. Thank you, Duncan.
Thank you very much.
In
nice
closing,
to be here.
From Forney Field, Bob LeMin for LCTV, taking a look.